Hi, this is Adam Elio Berkowitz from Israel 365 News, coming at you live from the Golan Heights, where all the fun is. Today, we're here with Tamar Sternthal. She's the director of the Israel office of CAMER, which is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America. She monitors both U.S. publications and English language Israel publications. And I think Tamar is really cutting edge because the real battleground, as we've been seeing, is in the media. The media is shaping things, pushing things where they shouldn't go. So Tamar is here with us today to help us set things straight. Thank you so much, Tamar, for coming with us. I have one big question. I've seen something in the media which I just cannot wrap my head around. It just seems too crazy and I can't understand it. So if you can, I'd love for you to unpack it for me. I saw an article in 972, and it's also been picked up in Haaretz, and this idea of Zionism being white nationalism. It's usually rejected because people are like, Zionism, it's Jewish. The Jews are the targets of white nationalism. But now there's the claim from the left wing, even from left-wing Jewish groups, claiming that Israel is a white nationalist nation. And usually this claim goes along with the claim that as such, the Zionist Christians, since they're only Zionist and not pro-Jewish, though most of them are, they are the real anti-Semites. And this claim just is so outlandish to me, yet I've seen it so much I can't reject it anymore. Could you please explain to me how people get to this, and tell me if it really is a serious claim?
Well, first of all, Eliyahu, thank you so much for inviting me to the show. And I remember when you contacted me a few days ago about this article that you saw in the Fringe left-wing 972 magazine. That's an outfit here in Israel that publishes both in English and in Hebrew, which alleged that certain elements of the far right have embraced the Israeli flag in Zionism as a symbol because the notion that Israel is a supremacist state fits very well with their ideology. And while that's a fringe publication, unfortunately, this idea has gotten traction in the mainstream media, which has been an accomplice to this idea. And I just want to zero in on the language for a minute. This particular language associating Jews and Zionism with supremacism made headlines in the mainstream media twice within recent weeks. One was concerning a Republican congresswoman from California, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who recently was stripped of her positions in committees in Congress, when it came to light that in 2018, she had tweeted that Jewish lasers are responsible for California wildfires. And that reminded people of another post, a video that she posted that was revealed back in August. And the post was from 2018 about that Zionist supremacists are seeking to bring in vast numbers of non-white immigrants to predominantly white countries. And this kind of ideology was the ideology that motivated the murder at the Pittsburgh synagogue. And the mainstream media recognized her as the bigot as she is. On the other hand, the second source of this defamation that Jews are supremacists or that Israel is a supremacist state is the Israeli NGO called B'Tselem. And far from being recognized as an extremist fringe element, this NGO was feted as a premier leading human rights organization in Israel. And its piece was embraced, and its false slurs were embraced and amplified by media outlets like The Guardian. The Guardian even ran an editorial claiming that I forget the exact, the Guardian editorial said that the nation state law in Israel, which does not in any way impinge on the civil rights of minorities in Israel, but just ensures that the character as a national collective of Israel is Jewish, that the nation state law constitutionally enshrines Jewish supremacy. So here it's really shocking. You see in a far left organization that says it's for human rights, that opposes Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria, it's it's using language that really has a toxic history in the far right. Where does the language of Jewish supremacy come from? From David Duke. He had a book in 2002, right?
It's Jewish supremacy. I just can't. I'm sorry. That's another one of those things I can't wrap my mind around. It's something that's never been a thing, never been a part of Judaism, never been a reality, and here it is being pushed as a narrative.
Absolutely. And so, while it has a toxic history on the right, the language that's being used by folks at B'Tselem is not piggybacking onto that, but tapping into ideologies and movements on the progressive left in America right now. So it's tapping on the language of supremacy that's popular in, for instance, critical race theory and other ideologies that are really behind movements in the left right now.
I want to point out, this is not a fact-based narrative or fact-based. There's nothing fact-based about it. B'Tselem recently changed a long policy, and they referred to Israel as apartheid. Now, anyone who's been to Israel, you see the big red signs that say Jews may not enter. Jews cannot go into. It is an apartheid, but it goes the other way. Jews are not allowed to pray everywhere. They're not allowed to enter everywhere. Yet the Palestinians are. So this is not a fact-based narrative, but it has very real implications.
In no way is it a fact-based narrative. In fact, Camera published on our website, www.camera.org, an extensive report by my colleague, a researcher in Boston, Gilad Inni, who looked at the report in depth and really unpacked it piece by piece. First of all, what's going on? They are conflating citizenship with supremacy, right? By definition, citizenship discriminates. It gives certain benefits and rights to those who belong to that national group and those who don't. So apartheid, and that's the name of the report, This is Apartheid, the B'Tselem report, is a system of oppression. And this is according to, international definitions of apartheid. It's a system of oppression which uses atrocities like murder, rape, land dispossession, deportations, et cetera, all these things that do not apply, and to put a system of domination of one race over another. And if you look at the report, 2/3 of the things that B'Tselem talks about are things that differences between the citizens of Israel, who are Jews and non-Jews alike. Remember, about 20% of the population in Israel are minorities, Arabs, whether they're Christians or Muslims, and the disparities between them and the non-Jews. And then it goes on to say, the disparities between the population of Israel, Jews and non-Jews together have the same rights versus the non-citizens who are the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And the B'Tselem report just conflates and confounds. And then it goes on to argue that also the Israeli Arabs, they call them the Palestinians of Israel, are discriminated against. And yet they don't give a single valid example. What is the main example that they use to argue that the citizens, the Israeli Arab citizens, are discriminated against? The fact that there's a preferential treatment for Jews abroad, that is for non-citizens who want to immigrate to Israel. But that affects foreigners who aren't citizens of Israel. It doesn't affect the citizens, Arab citizens of Israel. And there's nothing unique about this. This has no connection to Jewish supremacy. There are many countries that have this preferential treatment to their ethnic groups, such as Poland, Ireland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, many, many countries.
The immigration policy for the United States is not an easy process at all.
Tamar, this is very reminiscent of the infamous UN resolution that Zionism is racism.
Oh, I
Can you
remember
just
that.
touch on that?
Absolutely. It goes right back to that. It's going right back to the Soviet campaign that Zionism is racism. And the international community rejected that. That was overthrown. And now it's coming back. And I think it's really important at this point to bring into the discussion the IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. That's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, because this definition has been adopted by some 30 countries, many in Europe. It's being picked up by some campuses in the UK, for instance. I think it was just adopted by the city of Paris, which might be the second capital after Jerusalem to adopt it. It was adopted, a very almost identical definition was adopted by the Obama State Department. And it was adopted under the Trump administration by the Department of Education in the United States. And some of it is very obvious, but the part that groups various NGOs, including Israeli and NGOs on the far left, object to, they're pushing back against the IHRA definition. They don't like it. In particular, what don't they like? They don't like the part that says denying Jews the right to self-determination is anti-Semitic, and therefore claims that Israel inherently is racist, are anti-Semitic. And that's exactly what this B'Tselem report does. And at the same time as it's doing that, and it's polluting the public discourse with this kind of rejection of Zionism, there are these NGOs that are working very hard to try and push back against the IHRA definition. And the mainstream media, unfortunately, has been complicit by elevating many of these fringe NGOs and giving them more credibility than they deserve.
I want to point out, if you've touched on this, we keep mentioning, for example, the group B'Tselem. When you speak about humanitarian NGOs in Israel, there's a big smokescreen there. B'Tselem bills itself as a humanitarian NGO. First of all, their funding comes from anti-Israel sources. Second of all, they do not report any humanitarian offenses against Palestinians that come from the Palestinian Authority, which, if they were really concerned about bettering the condition of Palestinians, that would be part of their agenda, but it's absolutely not. So when you hear of these humanitarian NGOs, it's very important to do a little bit of research in them, and you'll see that these groups are not really humanitarian. That's not their agenda. Also, B'Tselem, it claims to be Israeli, though the number of actual Israelis who work there, Jewish Israelis who work there, is very small. It's really just a face. They are clearly anti-Israel. They have an agenda, and it isn't exclusively, or even, I would say, if I'm not mistaken, was it a B'Tselem activist who was an Arab who was caught giving over the names of and the contact info of Palestinians who were selling land to Israelis?
I think there was a B'Tselem staffer who was involved in that story. There was an NGO, an Israeli NGO on the right that went undercover into some of these far left Israeli NGOs and got some footage of this one Israeli activist who was working with some B'Tselem staffers, bragging about the fact that he reported some Palestinians who sold land to Jews to the Palestinian Authority, knowing that these people face imprisonment and possibly even death. I don't know. You made a point about the citizenship. What your point about the funding to B'Tselem coming from abroad is totally valid. And here in Israel, B'Tselem, its report didn't get really any coverage or any traction here, hardly any. It's not regarded as a serious player. And if you look I don't know about the citizenship of its staff. You said they're not Israelis. I can't vouch for that. I haven't looked into that, but I did look into the fact.
I can. I have friends who contacted them, and they had to work hard. They had to struggle to find someone who spoke Hebrew.
Okay, but as I said, 20% of our citizens here in Israel are Israeli Arabs and Christians and Muslims, and they're full citizens with full rights as citizens, and I don't discount them as citizens. But what is important to note, if your media outlets refer to it as a leading human rights organization in Israel, where is the battle of human rights waged? Is it waged in the media, abroad, in the Western media, or is it waged in the courts? In Israel, the battle for human rights is waged in the Knesset. It's waged in the Supreme Court. And guess what? B'Tselem is not active there at all. If you look at their 2019 annual activity report, it goes on for pages about all their social media coups, the tours that they've brought foreign European diplomats on to see various Palestinian communities in the West Bank, the number of views the videos have gotten and social media shares, the articles it's managed to get mentioned in and to place in various Western publications, but nothing about any legislation that it's managed to influence It hasn't brought any appeals or briefs to the High Court, unlike other Israeli NGOs. And on the international realm, where does one make an impact in the field of Israeli human rights? In the United Nations in Geneva and the Human Rights Council, and they're not there. There were two major events that took place in which other Israeli NGOs, the Universal UPI, Universal Periodic Review of various countries that takes place, and the one for Israel, I believe, was 2018 or 2019, and B'Tselem wasn't there. Other Israeli NGOs were there, and there was another important international forum in which any leading Israeli human rights organization ought to have had a part in Geneva, and they simply weren't there. So, you know, they wrote a report about fake justice on the Israeli Supreme Court, but really it's fake human rights on the part of B'Tselem.
So, Tamar, you touched on this. There's so many people out there who address this, but I really want to hear your take on it. Is criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism?
That's a great question, and there's people try and make it so complicated, but it's really quite simple. If you look again, I'll draw your attention back to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which explicitly states that criticism of Israel that's comparable to criticism of any other government or country is not anti-Semitic. But once again, when you get to the denial of the Jewish right to self-determination, when it's discomfort, like B'Tselem expresses with the very essence of a Jewish state, where it's not this or that particular policy, but the very notion that, you know, Palestinians who aren't citizens don't have the same rights as Israelis who are, including Arabs, then that's anti-Semitic. To say that Zionism is supremacy, that is anti-Semitic. So
yeah.
It's pretty clear. If you can make that kind of criticism about another country comfortably, and you would, then it's fair game. But I have to say the rhetoric is just all around this white supremacy language. It's just part of an escalated rhetoric that we're seeing with hostility towards Israel, towards Jews. Just on Thursday, there was a Democratic congressman from California named Ro Khanna, who was a guest on MSNBC with a host named Mehdi Hassan. And he told Hassan that President Biden needs to reset the relationship with Israel. Israel needs to stop burning Palestinian villages. No more burning Palestinian villages. No new settlements. And this burning Palestinian villages, that is taking a slander and a smear demonization to a new record. B'Tselem again, B'Tselem we come back to, back in November issued a report which got widely picked up that Israel had demolished an entire village in the northern West Bank called Khirbat Khumsa. And in actuality, it's just an encampment of a few, like a shepherding encampment of a few pens and things like that. And the United Nations picked up on the B'Tselem report and said that the entire community was destroyed. 75 people were made homeless and dozens of homes destroyed. But the Israeli authority that was responsible for the demolition, which took place because it was in a firing zone, and this is an area that is used by the army as a firing zone since 1972. And the High Court ruled on that and said these people are squatters and they have no ownership rights. And for their own safety, when exercises are taking place, they've been periodically removed many, many times throughout the years. And the Kogat, that's the Israeli authority that carried out the demolition back in November, when this B'Tselem report came about the destruction of a village, said there were 8 pens, animal pens, and 7 tents that were destroyed. And yet, again, the story got picked up all over. And I believe it was Rashida Tlaib who then tweeted that this was ethnic cleansing.
Right, it was a total blood libel.
Yeah, Camera compelled CBS to issue a number of corrections on the story. But I guess from, demolishing an entire village, which already wasn't true, the lie metastasized into burning a village.
I wrote about that particular statement by the California congressman today. I referenced your article, and basically he was citing an article that was debunked by you when it was first published. But your work is so, I love this word, Sisyphean. The more you've got a hole in the boat, and the more water you take out, the more water pours in. The damage not only was done, but is continuing to be done by these lying reports. And you're really on the cutting edge. You're the pointed edge of the spear, trying to stop lies from being perpetuated. And the lies are pointed at Israel in more than anyone else, and it's deeply troubling. I want to just mention one thing, which I'm not going to ask you to comment on, and I want to emphasize that this is not Tamar's area that she deals with, and it is not media. But this whole issue is kind of sneaking up on us very quickly. The reason is, if you define Zionism as white nationalism, and if you define pro-Zionist evangelical Christians as as not only white supremacists or nationalists because they're Zionists, but also as anti-Semites. Well, now the Biden government has started working against what they call domestic terrorism. So much so that the defense secretary ordered a 60-day stand down in order to fight extremism in the military. And when you have a nebulous definition like domestic terrorism or extremism, that can be used in ways that are really quite shocking. So, for example, if they say that they're fighting white supremacists, well, that could include if you're in the army and you express Zionist views, or if you're a pro-Zionist evangelical and you're in the army, you could be labeled as a white supremacist, a white nationalist, and proscribed and lose your commission and be booted from the army for that reason. Be labeled as a domestic terrorist. And that's why I'm very concerned that these definitions are being warped and into mean things that they really shouldn't mean, that they don't mean. That's why I'm seriously concerned. The language is really very, very much a part of what's happening here. So Tamar, I'm just wondering, is this something that you're seeing more of, that the evangelicals are being labeled as anti-Semites? Is this really now a thing? Is it happening more?
I'll get to the evangelicals. I just want to loop back to what you said about our Sisyphean task.
Okay.
And it's absolutely true, but I mean, there is a there are successes, and the story of actually Congressman Khanna, which was developing today, I posted about it this morning. I tweeted, I mean, our goal here is to get MSNBC to correct the falsehood, to correct on the air that Israel is not burning Palestinian villages, and Israel is not burning new settlements, by the way. That was another thing that was on the air that wasn't challenged. There have been no new settlements in 2 decades. There are new housing units in pre-existing communities over the Green Line. And this is a point that we compelled MSNBC itself to correct back in October. So we expect a correction here as well. So when I wrote about it and then I tweeted about it, I got a response from the congressman, much to my surprise. And we got in a back and forth, and he pointed out, which I hadn't seen, that he had clarified and backtracked, writing to a reporter to the Times of Israel. It appeared in the Times of Israel and Haaretz. So I said, thank you, and I'll update my post about that. But the falsehood appeared at MSNBC, and that's where it needs to be corrected. And presumably, Haaretz and Times of Israel's readers are less likely to believe a falsehood that Israel's burning villages than the average viewer of MSNBC. But he ended by saying that he appreciates our work. He asked me a policy question, which I wouldn't answer, just like I'm not going to go into the direction that you went into. We don't, at camera, engage in political issues and policy discussions. But he asked, and then we ended up on a very congenial note in which he was appreciative to being alerted to the facts, and he said he appreciates the work that we do, that it's an important part of democracy. So, you know, when conversation, public discourse has degenerated to such a low level with the kind of language that we see, and even it came from him, but in this case, I really believe it came out of ignorance, because once there was information that was shared, it just, it's reassuring to know that with it's not always the case, but with certain individuals, there is room for opening people's minds and giving them the right information. And the idea that there's no, you know, we're in a post-truth era. No, there still are people who still believe that, you know, even if the facts don't comport with your political outlook, that you're open and willing enough to accept them as they are. So in terms of Sisyphean, it's these moments that are very meaningful. And Camera has, you know, prompted over a record 220, I believe, 7 corrections on substantive issues in media, in English, in Spanish, in Arabic, in French, in coverage of Israel. So even though we're in this post-journalism era, and we can talk more about that, there still is the opportunity to try and bring things back to traditional reporting and adherence to factual standards. About the depiction of evangelical Christians, that's not, I do have two colleagues who are from the Camera's Christian media department, Dexter Van Zyl and Trisha Miller, and they follow these issues very, very closely. So I encourage your viewers to look them up on our website. That's not my area of expertise as much, but I do want to say, in terms of taking a group that's mainstream or centrist and sort of putting them on the margins, is a very common phenomenon that we're seeing in discussions of Jews and anti-Semitism. So it wouldn't surprise me if, you know, there are also many instances of taking views or positions of evangelical Christians which are rather mainstream, whether it's, you know, embracing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Well, just now 97-3, the Senate has voted a position that, you know, maybe 2-3 years ago in 2017, for instance, was considered totally out there. You know, they voted to, all but 3 voted to leave Israel's, the US embassy in Jerusalem. So demonizing of a large group of people.
All but 3, one of them was Bernie Sanders, one of them was Elizabeth Warren. So
right, but that high number shows that this has become really a consensus issue. But think back to 2017, when it was, you know, the evangelicals who were behind the move, and that was perhaps a big reason why it happened. And maybe, I don't know, but think of how, you know, what a bashing that a policy decision took in the media. Mm-hmm. And now it's, you know, maybe because it's a fait accompli, or maybe because it's no longer Trump in office, that it hasn't raised a huge stir in the media. But we do see, in terms of these questions around anti-Semitism, the major groups, certainly in the Jewish community, being marginalized. So you have the elevation of the fringe groups like B'Tselem, and at the same time, the significant groups are being pushed to the sides. And I'll give you an example to an article in the New York Times, I think it was from 2019, and it was around the Jeremy Corbyn labor anti-Semitism scandal. And the chief rabbi of the UK, Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, came out with an, I think, unprecedented letter in which he said that Corbyn is unfit for office because of the way that he handled the scandal. And the New York Times ran a story about how this letter prompted a debate in the British Jewish community. That this was a very controversial position and action that the chief rabbi did. But in fact, there's no debate. A survey that was taken of the Jewish community found that 90% believe that Corbyn himself is anti-Semitic. And there's vast agreement that he mishandled the anti-Semitism crisis and that he himself was an active part of it. So who was the debate? Who were the people who were against Mervis's letter? Well, there was exactly one source that was quoted, an outfit that's tiny and was founded just a few months before, called Jews Against Boris. And it has 1,200 followers on Twitter versus thousands of followers of the mainstream British Jewish organizations like Board of Deputies of the Jewish Communities, Community for Security Trust, and there's one more leading Jewish organization. They have offices, staffs, board of directors, and you know what? They weren't mentioned, not at all in that article. Yet this organization, Jews Against Boris, had 3 or 4 paragraphs dedicated to them, arguing against the Mervis letter. And we found out, and some research around the article, I noticed that the New York Times reporter, Benjamin Mueller, reached out to the Twitter account of Jews Against Boris for comment. So he sought them out. So that was a very clearly ideological decision to do so. So like I said, just bringing it back to the evangelicals, it wouldn't surprise me. Look, you know, the evangelicals were big supporters of Trump, and every position that he took became, you know, having to do with Israel was opposed. And I think that if others were to have taken those positions, they wouldn't have been. Just another example, there was an article on an official in the Department of Education named Kenneth Stein. In any event, that's not his name. Maybe Kenneth Stern, who adopted was an advocate for adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And how did the New York Times define this definition? It said he unilaterally adopted the controversial definition. Meanwhile, there was no mention of the fact that it's been adopted by dozens of Western governments, that it was adopted by the State Department of the Obama administration. So here there's a marginalization, you know, certain positions or people or ideas who don't fit the narrative are marginalized and made to seem like there's a debate around them, like they're controversial, or they're not at all mentioned in the case of major Jewish organizations. Going back to the B'Tselem report, the Associated Press story, which was one of the very first stories that came out about it, and Associated Press as a wire service is really, really, really important because it's picked up by media outlets around the world. And the critics to the B'Tselem article were way down in the article. So what happens? The AP story goes to newspapers around the world, and newspapers have to cut for space restrictions, and they cut from the bottom. So all the critics were cut out. And we had written to AP and we said, please move these critics further up, because this is a very fringe position that B'Tselem has taken. So the critics, if you're going to report it at all, put the critics right there at the very top. And the AP declined to make that change. So
that's actually, I want to make another comment on I love this word, Sisyphean nature of your work. I'm very glad that you were able to reach out to Representative Rohit Kahana. He's actually a Hindu, and he calls himself a Gandhiist Hindu. He seems like a very sweet guy, to be honest, with really great intentions. But here he was accessing information, agenda-driven, inaccurate information from a fringe small group who has, I think, an outsized influence. And here you are. It used to be, you know, you could pick up the New York Times, the Washington Post. You could make sure they're writing accurate stuff, and your day was done. But now there's just such a flood of information. Has this affected your job? Is it still possible to watchdog the media?
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. There's been a sea change. I started working for Camera in 1999. I started as a researcher in the Boston headquarters of the organization. And I came working from a Jewish weekly. I was an associate editor of the largest Jewish newspaper in New England, the Jewish Advocate. So that's the kind of home I grew up in, traditional journalism, dealing with paper. When I came to Camera in 1999, the New York Times was a paper of the dead tree variety. We had a website that only a few pioneering users would look to. But now, as we know, the New York Times is a very robust website with all kinds of podcasts. All the journalists have their own Twitter, and all various, I don't even know what other kinds of social media feeds. New York Times has invested heavily in podcasts and doing something called forensic investigation. So for instance, in addition to a 5,000 word article that they did on a Gaza medic who died in violence, the March of Return violence by the Gaza-Israel border, she was killed, it turned out, by a ricocheted bullet. But they had invested so much into this multimedia digital production, proving that, I guess they were hoping to prove that it was a war crime, because though the results showed that it was a ricocheted bullet, the reporter still said that it was maybe a war crime. So that's where they had hoped to be going with that. So yes, the internet has changed the face of journalism drastically. You know, the New York Times is competing with all of these digital publications that have sprouted up over the years, from the right and from the left: Salon, BuzzFeed, Vox, Daily Beast, you name it. They're much edgier, they're faster, they're more sensational. It's unclear that they adhere to the same standards of journalistic ethics.
It seems to be that the emphasis is to be the first, the most sensational, and then backtrack and check your facts. And
absolutely.
that's not journalism.
Absolutely. And I think that the advent of all these new digital publications have eroded the standards of the mainstream publications. And we saw that, are you familiar with the podcast Caliphate that the New York Times did in 2000? I think it came out in 2018, and it was released to much fanfare. They pushed it really, really hard. The starring character of this podcast was a Canadian of Pakistani origin who said he had been an ISIS fighter in Syria. And the series includes gruesome descriptions of executions that he said he carried out. Well, it turns out there's no evidence that he ever stepped foot in Syria. He's been arrested in Canada for committing a terrorism hoax. And the New York Times had to give back its Peabody Award that it received for this, Pulitzer, and I think one other very prestigious journalism award. And in one article by a New York Times reporter about this whole scandal, his name is Ben Smith, he wrote that the podcast was really the face of the new paper, that the paper is going through a revolution from a stodgy paper of record to a sensational stream of podcasts and narratives.
Some people refer to it as the New York Times, formerly a newspaper.
Right. Or as I recently wrote in the Times of Israel, the New York Times was once the paper of record. Move over, paper of record. Now the paper of narrative is here. And this was confirmed by a reporter within the newsroom. And we know about the op-ed contributor, Barry Weiss, who stepped down, who because of the hostile atmosphere in terms of not willing to entertain any ideas outside of their own Orthodox bubble, Orthodox, in terms of ideologically. And she said she'd always been taught, like I had, in the notion of traditional journalism, that journalism is the first draft of history. And that's been turned on its head. And the New York Times we pick on because it sets the tone and content. It's still, the most influential leading publication in terms of influence. And it's not that journalism is the first draft of history, but that history must be, and not only history, current events, even present day language must be massaged and fit into the truths as the New York Times journalists who believe them to be. These are truths that they believe that they possess, that they share with others. And it's to such a degree that, I see this playing out in our own interactions with the paper. We're in regular communication with editors there for years and years and years. As I said, I'm there for 20 years. The organization is around since 1982, and we've always been in close contact with editors in the various departments at the Times. And we used to very regularly prompt corrections there, and we find it's getting much harder.
That's crazy. I'm sorry, because I know that I appreciate it when people come up to me and say, "You got this wrong," and I'm like, okay, time to publish a retraction, which is much easier today than it used to be, because you don't have to print up a new newspaper. You just have to go online to WordPress and bang, you've got your retraction, you've got your correct information. So you would think it would be easier, more readily, they would be more ready to, more eager to get it right. So that's kind of counterintuitive that they don't want to.
Even things that they've corrected in the past, they refuse to correct now. References to Jesus being Palestinian or living in Palestine, but the chronology is way off because the area didn't become known as Palestine until 1,000 years after his death. They've corrected that repeatedly in the past, making clear that no, he lived in Judea. He spoke Aramaic. He didn't speak. He wasn't a Palestinian. The language that he spoke was Aramaic. And they've corrected that in the past, but when we last brought it up to them, no response. Also, their own historical record does not move them. So when they recently published an art review by a writer who's an art writer, he writes for an art blog, and he had this piece in the New York Times, and he said that in 1948, Haifa's Arabs were expelled or escaped. Well, we went back into the archives of the New York Times and found the coverage from the reporter who was reporting for them at the time, who talked about the exodus of Arabs from Haifa and said that there was a meeting between the Arab leadership and the Haganah leaders in the presence of the British authorities, and that the Arab leadership was offered a truce, which would have ensured the citizens' safety, and they rejected it, opting for flight instead. So escape means that you're running away from a danger, but there was no danger. And certainly the falsehood that they fled was also likewise debunked by their own coverage, which they refused to pay attention to.
That Jesus is a Palestinian narrative. It's been, the fact that it gets published in mainstream media is astounding, because it's actually, the roots of that were within, I think it was Hanan Ashrawi. Was it Hanan Ashrawi who began it? But it began within the Palestinian Liberation Organization with Arafat, was adopted by the PA. It's now their mainstream narrative. And even Raphael Warnock, who was just elected to the Congress, I believe, he's a pastor, and he was using that narrative. And and the thing is, him saying it, the video is readily available, and yet there it is, everyone can see it, but the mainstream media still won't come out and say, what's clear and obvious to everyone. That to me is astounding, and they need to be held accountable to that. They need to tell the truth. That's it.
You're probably more knowledgeable about these references to Jesus as a Palestinian within the Christian world than I am. I mean, I know I see it in the mainstream media, but my colleagues in the Christian department, Dexter Van Zyl in particular, is planning to sort of collect all these instances within the Christian world of references to Jesus as a Palestinian, really? and go after them and try and get them correct. So this is something that we really do have our finger on, and we'd like to see.
So I want to talk to him. I've wanted to talk to him for a while. I've read his articles. He's awesome, and then some. The case of Raphael Warnock, it goes even further. He referred to Jesus as a Palestinian prophet. And as a Jew, I'm like, oh, he's not a Palestinian. But my Christian friends were even more insulted, because they're like, Jesus as a prophet? That kind of threw them for a loop, and they explained to me, no, that's not how we view Jesus. The people who view Jesus as a prophet are the Muslims. And Raphael Warnock has also come out very much in favor of the Nation of Islam, and there's a lot of questions to be asked there. So this is a very problematic narrative. Tamar, I could speak to you day and night. You are a font of knowledge. I so appreciate it. I'm going to ask you to when you have more time to come back and speak with us, because there are several issues I'd like to talk to you about. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank our audience.
Thank you, Eliyahu. Thank you,
Tamar,
John, for the background.
your work is absolutely essential. You're taking the people who are the worst offenders and spreading lies, and you're holding their feet to the fire. And I really appreciate it. So I'd like to thank our guests for joining us. We've had a great time. If you bless us, we have no choice. We have to bless you back. That's the way it works. That's the way it's written. And it's a blessing coming from Israel, which counts for a lot. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been Israel 365 News. Have a great day.